right, time now for the Keiser Report, markets, finance, and scandals. All the scandals that are driving the global economy into the ditch. Let's get more details from Stacy Herbert.
Max Keiser. The first headline reads, PIMCO likens U.S. to Ponzi scheme. This is Bill Gross, who manages $250 billion PIMCO bond portfolio. He wrote in his newsletter to his clients, check writing in the trillions is not a bondholder's friend. It is in fact inflationary and, if truth be told, somewhat of a Ponzi scheme. So he argues that creditors have always expected to be paid out of future growth. But now, he says, growth in doubt, it seems the Fed has taken Ponzi one step further. The Fed has joined the party itself. Has there ever been a Ponzi scheme so brazen? There has not.
Right, so we need to examine this a little bit because everyone knows the Ponzi scheme concept from the Bernie Madoff scandal. That as new money came in, he would pay out old investors, and he built this pyramid up. And what PIMCO is saying, Bill Gross, I guess, is that the Fed now, by joining together various elements of the banking and government systems, is able to create the mother of all Ponzi schemes. And the suckers who are coming in at this point, this is the money that will almost guaranteed be lost.
Well, that's right. And so he's talking about the Fed's expected announcement of new quantitative easing. This is, they're going to buy up various assets. We don't know yet until they start to do it. But actually, Bill Gross goes on to say that he thinks it's a good idea because there's a liquidity trap.
Yeah, well, I noticed that the Bank of Japan has announced that they are expanding their definition of quantitative easing, and they'll be buying actually stocks and bonds and real estate and precious metals. And gold spiked up on this news. And to get back on, last show's topic, we asked people, Lloyd Blankfein, here he is, arch criminal, arch financial terrorist of the 21st century. We asked, is Lloyd Blankfein, should we decapitate him in effigy, of course, his doll? Or should we waterboard him? And we got some interesting responses. What have we got over there?
Well, Max, here's one from Paul from Batavia. First, have his doll appropriately cursed by a voodoo priest. It shouldn't be hard to find one in Haiti. They're all pretty ticked off right now. Then, following his instructions, insert pins in the desired body parts.
Well, let me show you what we've been doing so far in our program. I mean, this isn't the first time we've been busy engaged in this type of citizens action committee. I mean, here's Ben Bernanke here. You get a good shot of Ben Bernanke. Notice it's just a head of Ben Bernanke. The rest of his body is missing.
Well, that's one thing we have found, that no matter what you do to the top of this Ponzi scheme of bankers, there's always another banker to replace. You remove Lloyd Blankfein from the equation, then, well, first of all, you removed Hank Paulson from the equation.
Well, exactly. Here he is. Here's Hank Paulson. We try to remove him from the equation, but just another banker pops up. They've got a banker infestation problem.
That's correct. So there's always another Ponzi scheme operator to step in. And so here we're talking about Ben Bernanke and his new quantitative easing thing. Well, here's a headline on quantitative easing. A paralyzed Fed defers decision on monetary policy to primary dealers in an act that can only be classified as treason. So, according to Zero Hedge, the New York Fed has issued a survey to primary dealers which asks for suggestions on the size of QE2 as well as the time over which it should be completed.
Treason?
So Business Insider's headline on this, Ben Bernanke is now simply asking Wall Street how much stimulus it wants. So asking those effigies, asking the real life versions of these guys how much money they need to keep the party going.
That's right. There's no justice. There's no rule of law. And in a world with no justice, clearly there's a demand for Mini-Max. Mini-Max is the final word in justice. Now, what people might not understand is that if in case Goldman Sachs tries to open a bank in a galaxy far, far away, there's Micro Mini Space Max. Micro Mini Space Max can actually fly into parallel dimensions if need be to chase down the financial terrorist and to deliver justice. Deliver justice is what we seek.
Well, okay, so let's go back to this story. So the Fed has asked the primary dealers. Who are the primary dealers? Well, they're the likes of Cantor Fitzgerald, JP Morgan, HSBC, Bank of America, Goldman Sachs, Credit Suisse, Deutsche Bank, RBS, and UBS. So Zero Hedge says the reason why they're saying this is treason is because they're now being put in control of U.S. monetary and fiscal policy.
That's right. Well, the primary dealers, you mentioned a few, they're arsonists, and they're asking for more matches. And the Federal Reserve is just giving them all the matches they need and lighter fluid to continue to destroy the economy. All the quantitative easing, all the free money they want. They can front run this free money, which means as they see the orders coming down the pike, they can place orders. So when the rat goes through the snake, they place an order ahead of the rat getting through that part of the snake. And as the rat goes through that snake, put a nice little graphic up there, you see, as the rat makes it through the snake, you see, put an order in there and you can pocket by inside information. If it wasn't for inside information, there would be no economy whatsoever.
So let's look at this headline to see how these bankers are doing, how good their life is thanks to Ben Bernanke operating this Ponzi scheme on behalf of the bankers. The biggest, richest party ever. This is the global party, and this is how their website reads. 80,000 plus of the world's elite, 80 plus of the world's finest locations, all within 24 hours. So they want to have this big party of rich people. It's £100,000 per table. And the Wall Street Journal writes about this party being put on by a hedge fund manager in the UK who's married to Uma Thurman. And he's one of these people who fed clients into Bernie Madoff's fund. Wall Street Journal writes, before we get all judgmental, let's be clear that this is all for charity. The money, an expected £5 to £10 million, will all go to charity.
Well, let's be clear about something. Uma Thurman's husband, hedge fund schmata, these guys are living on the largesse of a corrupt banking system. They don't work for a living. They exist on subsidies, gifts, and handouts from a corrupt banking system in bed with the politicians. And the quid pro quo is that they tacitly give the green light to things like war in Afghanistan, war in Iraq, the bombing of Iran coming soon from the same group of corrupt hedge funds and politicians. So when WikiLeaks comes out and they say, you know what, the number of dead in Iraq in the hundreds of thousands, supports the Lancet report, which talks about up to 1 million civilians dead. That's the blood on Uma Thurman's husband's hedge fund schmata's hands. You're dripping in blood because you're a murderer. You support murder, okay? Now come on the show and defend yourself. Oh, that's right. You're too busy swilling it up with your swell friends and you're a coward. Otherwise you'd be on the show. Otherwise you'd defend yourself. But you're not, because you are. So shut up!
So Stanley Fink is interviewed in this article for the Wall Street Journal. He's a hedge fund manager and a Tory party treasurer. And he says, yes, to the average man in the street, they do look obscene, but they do an incredible amount of good.
They don't do any good. You're talking about $5 or $10 million in charity versus bankrupting the economy, putting millions out of work, people starving to death. These are the charlatans that are destroying the economy. They're not doing anything good. And the Wall Street Journal, of course, is the poster child. It's the rag. It's Murdoch's rag that he puts out there with these editorials that are concocted by a diseased mind of another oligarch. You're talking about Murdoch, an oligarch, telling his hedge fund oligarch supporters that it's okay to starve kids around the world to have your swell little champagne parties. You know, this is pathetic. You know, this is why Marie Antoinette ultimately ended up in a state not dissimilar to what we see right here with who is this schmuck? Oh, this is frickin' Ben Bernanke, okay? Notice he's missing his body! You know what I'm saying? Uma Thurman, husband, schmata, hedge fund guy? Do you think you need your body?
Okay, the next headline supports what you're saying about the bottom 99.9% being eviscerated. New figures detail depth of unemployment misery, lower earnings for all but super wealthy. So these are numbers released this month by the Social Security Administration, but it didn't make headlines until Pulitzer Prize-winning tax reporter David K. Johnston looked at the numbers. And what he found was that 1 out of every 34 Americans who earned wages in 2008 earned absolutely zero, nothing from unemployment, welfare, nothing in 2009. And yet, average wages, median wages, and total wages all declined, except at the very top, where they leaped dramatically, increasing 5-fold.
Well, look for the Wall Street Journal and Rupert Murdoch to write an editorial soon called The Final Solution. Because obviously there's too many poor people than the system can support. So let's just round them up and incinerate them. I mean, that's going to be Murdoch's answer and the hedge fund's answer. And then we've seen this movie before. And it's time, I think, to step ahead of this freight train of corruption and to maybe do something or end up living on a reservation, a concentration camp, or burnt to a crisp at the bottom of an incinerator somewhere, or you don't care.
And every time these guys get together, of course, as their wages, their share of the pie is increasing fivefold annually. You're going to see more and more that they're saying we're just meeting for charity. The G20, we're meeting to help the world. The UN, we're meeting to feed the world. As more and more money goes up to them. And the U.S. midterms are, of course, today, and everybody's expecting the Tea Party to, save the day. The final headline, Max: Wall Street's Tea Party. The 12 leading Tea Party Senate candidates have accepted over $4.6 million in campaign contributions from Wall Street for these elections. Pat Toomey collected $1.2 million. Jim DeMint, who the Financial Times calls the head, basically, of the Tea Party in the Senate. Mark Rubio from Florida. And so it looks like the same there.
Well, the Tea Party are for hire. I mean, they'll go and they'll get in the way of any populist movement to restore power down to the citizens at the base level of the citizenry. And they, except for Carl Denninger, the entire Tea Party. You notice that when you're talking about oligarchs who replace the word charity with cake, like let them eat charity, is let them eat cake, let them eat charity, okay? This is what they're talking about. Let them have a little charity/cake. And of course, if you're talking about cake, you need a little tea to go with your Tea Party, goes with the cake. So these are the same royalists. They all sit to the right of the monarch. The Tea Party sits to the right of the monarch. They're not pushing back in any way that's meaningful in terms of a progressive movement. They're just more killers for hire. And unfortunately, Obama has been the weakest president of the past 50 years. He's got no base whatsoever. He inspired no one except the health industry to extract billions and more subsidies. Stacy Herbert, thanks so much for being on the Keiser Report.
Thank you, Max.
Now, don't go away. We've got plenty more coming your way, so stay right there. Welcome back to the Keiser Report. Time now to go to San Francisco to talk with James Scaminacci III, who has been writing about the Tea Party movement. James is a former civilian intelligence analyst who worked for the Department of Defense, where he specialized in putting unindicted war criminals in prison in Bosnia. He also specialized in counter-organized crime and counter-terrorism. James Scaminacci III, welcome to the Keiser Report.
Thank you for having me, Max. Glad to be on.
All right, now, you've been writing about the Tea Party movement and their platforms. It's all guns, gays, God, as Carl Denninger says. Now, do they have any policies on Wall Street and the economy?
Well, the Tea Party protests were never about Wall Street. They weren't motivated to get out on the street because of the bank bailout. In fact, if you look at the literature that came out of the libertarian think tanks that were plugged into the Tea Party movement, it was all about the government was taking over the banks. And so it was a defense of private property that they were making. They weren't really upset about the fact that of the money. They were just upset about they thought it was a bad government takeover of the banks. They didn't see it as actually what it really was a Wall Street robbery of the Treasury.
Right, so, but at this stage of the game, the Tea Party candidates seem to be woefully disconnected from the realities on the ground in terms of you could be characterized as the plutocrats that they are now working for. So is there anyone in the Tea Party movement who's not been completely compromised, who's not completely corrupted?
Yeah, back in, I think it was like mid-2010, John Boehner went up to Wall Street and said, donate to the Republican Party and we'll block Wall Street regulatory reform. There was no protest out of the Tea Party movement at that time. Boehner has now given hundreds of thousands of dollars spread around to Tea Party candidates. Rand Paul is taking money from Mitch McConnell, who's gathering money from Wall Street. These guys have nothing, they have no problems with Wall Street. They have no problems with the ripoff.
All right, so the Tea Party candidates are raking in huge Wall Street donations. And as you point out, They don't seem to be concerned about the larceny that's going on in Wall Street. It looks now that they've just become another part of the Wall Street machine. And the war spending, the $3 trillion, as Joseph Stiglitz has projected, this is something, again, that the Tea Party does not seem to care about, even though it's a fundamental reason why there is the need, ostensibly, for some kind of reform party to begin with.
There's actually two Tea Party movements. And one was organized by David Koch and the Americans for Prosperity, and then you had the Freedom Works coming in on that. And then there was one organized by Ron Paul. And Ron Paul, of course, has been trying to cut defense spending, get out of Iraq, get out of Afghanistan, and oppose the Patriot Act. And that part of the movement is actually much smaller than the Koch movement. And if you saw Sarah Palin when she went to the Nashville convention in February 2010, it was very much a neoconservative talk on foreign policy. Very hard line, very pro-war in the guise of being pro-military. And so there's actually this competitiveness, there's this ideological rift in the Tea Party movement, but it's dwarfed by the fact that most of the right wing, most of the Christian right, are in fact neoconservative, hardline, foreign policy and militaristic kind of people. And it ties very much into their end times thought and theology and their Christian Zionism. So they're very much hard line on the military, and they're not really going to be focused on cutting defense spending or cutting our deployments into Afghanistan.
Right, and David Koch, of course, the part of the pair, the Koch brothers, who in the last couple of years anyway, there's been a lot of investigation into their support of climate change denial groups, who are the front groups to perpetrate and to put out the false information suggesting that there is no such thing as man-made global warming and climate change, which of course directly lines the pocket of the Koch brothers. Now the Koch brothers have co-opted the Tea Party movement. They've co-opted Ron Paul and others to put forward this so-called grassroots movement, which is what's called an astroturf movement. There's nothing grassroots about it. It's from the oligopoly on down. And they've got these cute shiksas out there like Sarah Palin or Christine O'Donnell. They show a little thigh, and all these white guys vote for them because they're lonely and they don't know what's in their self-interest.
Here's what I would say to that, Max. I don't really disagree with what you're saying. It goes kind of into the false consciousness of the working class or middle class. But here's what I would say. If you look at the right wing over the last 30, 40 years, even from the 1960s when it really started, they have an ideology or a theology that plugs very much into a right-wing, very libertarian, conservative economic program. And because they perceive the federal government as being evil and satanic and liberals as being the agents of Satan, they have an ideology and a theology, whether they're on the secular side or the religious side, that they don't believe anything that comes out of the federal government or comes from science. And so it's very easy for a Koch or an Exxon or whatever oil company wants to do this, is to promote climate change denial, is because these people don't believe it on theological grounds.
Yeah, well, it's amazing that some of these Tea Party candidates don't understand that one of the founding principles of the United States was the separation of church and state. They seem to think that it's perfectly acceptable to have a theocratic, autocratic, extremist form of ultra-neoconservative, right-wing terrorists running the country, like the Koch brothers and their minions, and they don't seem to understand that it was this very thing that got the founders of the country to revolt to begin with. Why are they throwing the keys of America away back to the monarchs?
The right wing has been influenced since the early 1960s by Christian Reconstructionism, which was founded by R.J. Rushdoony. And it's now promoted by Gary North, who is Ron Paul's informal strategic advisor on the Tea Party movement, and other people around Ron Paul, like Howard Phillips, who's the head of the Constitution Party, and McGinnis, who's the head of the John Birch Society. All these guys have bought into this kind of Christian Reconstructionism, that America was founded as a Christian nation, and the Constitution and all laws ought to be based upon biblical law, And that's the reason why these candidates now, like Christine O'Donnell, will talk about, well, the separation of church and state is not in the Constitution. Well, those specific words aren't in the Constitution, but the Establishment Clause is. And they've bought into this Reconstructionist interpretation of America as a Christian nation. And that's why they expound what they do. It's that the media can't see beyond these people. They're not kooks. They're extreme, but they're not kooks, they're not idiots. They have a completely different ideology and a completely different theology, and people don't see the broad, strong influence of Christian Reconstructionism on the entire right-wing movement, not just the Tea Party movement.
All right, so basically America wants to forget about the Enlightenment.
Absolutely.
At what point will the Fed demand that the banks on Wall Street turn water into wine, and to survive in America, 330 million people on one loaf of bread and a bucket of fish?
That's a very tough question to answer, Max.
Well, isn't that what Gary North is suggesting? That America should live on one loaf of bread and a bucket of fish, according to his biblical interpretations? He's not an economist, Gary North. He's a propagandist. And I have in touch with his people to get him on the show. If you were to ask Gary North one question, and I hope to get him on the show, what would it be?
When are you going to start the revolution, Max?
I'm saying if you were to ask Gary North one question.
Yeah. Well, that's what the question I'd ask him. Gary North put forth the strategy for Ron Paul, and that their strategy is based on two things. The first thing is to delegitimize the federal government. And the entire right wing, not only the Tea Party movement, but the entire right wing is trying to delegitimize the federal government, not just delegitimize President Obama. The second thing is that the central premise of the North Ron Paul strategy is that the federal government will financially collapse, and that will bring them to power.
Well, I mean, don't these people have a right to be afraid of the federal government? I mean, the federal government's been involved in the Patriot Act, in Constitution abuse, in assassinations.
Yes, I become really amused when certain progressives or certain progressive organizations make fun of the conspiracy theories, if you will, of the right wing. And it's not really totally fair because, if you look at the situation, there's elements of truth in those conspiracy theories. And progressives should take them to heart. I mean, I was shocked one day. I was reading R.J. Evans's book on how the Nazis came to power. And the second volume was The Nazis in Power. And he had a whole basic chapter on what the Nazis did very early on against the communists, the socialists, the Jews, and the weak. And you could go through, and I found like about 9 or 10 things that the Nazis very early in their administration did that George Bush and Obama have done. So, the federal government is a threat to civil liberties. There's no doubt about that. Where I part company with the right wing is like, so what are you doing about it? All you do is spread conspiracy theories. Do you act against the Patriot Act? Do you try to repeal it? Do you try to do anything constructive? I don't think they do.
Is there anything in the quiver of possible remedies the right wing could do? I mean, what comes to mind immediately is that Second Amendment. Does that play into this at all?
Well, that's their cornerstone of the Constitution actually is the Second Amendment. And what they basically argue is, from a theological point of view, is that our rights are God-given, and if the federal government transgresses those rights, then you have the God-given right to pick up a weapon and fight the federal government. So, yeah, they view it that way. I think they would be more successful on, let's say, opposing the Patriot Act if they reached out to progressive groups, if they worked with the American Civil Liberties Union, other groups, and said, there's specific parts of the Patriot Act that we want to change. But they don't. They just want to put forth the conspiracy theories, raise people's fear, anger, paranoia, call it what you will, and suck people into the movement.
Right. And of course, the one guy in Congress who was voting against the Patriot Act, Russ Feingold, looks like he's going to be replaced by one of these Tea Party people.
Yeah, these guys are Republicans. They're gonna elect Republicans. Russ Feingold is like a demonstration of principle over politics, and they're opposed to him. There's no reason actually they should be opposed to Russ Feingold. But they want to elect Republicans. They're ideologically driven, and the people who drive this movement, okay, it's not driven from the ground up. It's driven from the top down by these Christian theocrats. Is they need to get rid of everybody in their way.
All right, well, James Scaminacci III, thanks so much for being on the Keiser Report.
Thank you for having me, Max.
All righty, and that's going to do it for this edition of the Keiser Report with me, Max Keiser, and Stacy Herbert. I want to thank my guest, James Scaminacci III. If you want to send me an email, please do so at keiserreport@rttv.ru. Until next time, this is Max Keiser saying bye, y'all.